Well, hi everyone. It's Thursday morning and it's a great day, isn't it? And we're here in Texas and we're still talking about our week last week when we were in Austin, Texas. And the place we were staying had a park nearby. And I kind of stumbled across it and it piqued my interest. And I want to talk about what that park was about in just a moment. Let me give you the verse for today, however. And it comes from the book of Colossians, chapter 3, at verse 23. And it says, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord that is a reward." In other words, when God gives us a job to do, we do it with all our heart and all the best. How does that come into play with today? Because what this park that I came across had to say, it actually was a remembrance of one of the hardest jobs ever. And so we're going to talk about that. What was that job? Well, the park was called Chisholm Park. Now, are you familiar with the Chisholm Trail? I knew it as a name, but I wasn't exactly sure what it was. Do you remember when we were younger and we watched Westerns a lot? Westerns on TV or even Westerns at the movie. And especially those that had cattle drives in them. Well, think about that and the cowboys that kept those cattle in line, and they were basically driving them to market usually. Well, the Chisholm Trail was one of the longest cattle drive trails ever secured or ever founded, ever discovered or explored. It was in its time considered one of the wonders of the Western world. Isn't that something? Because what had happened is this. When the Civil War happened from the early 1860s, it ended in 1865. And during those years, the cattle in Texas had multiplied because the ranchers were off to war. And the cattle were just left to graze. And what do cattle left to their own do? Well, they multiply. And they multiplied greatly. And so when the men came back, they had tons of cattle. But the problem is when you have lots of cattle or lots of anything, what happens? Well, the price goes down. Cattle were selling for $4 a head in 1865. They were $40 a head throughout the east and north. And so clearly what had to happen, or what was going to happen, is those farmers, ranchers, were going to find a way to get their cattle to market. It was worth 10 times and more of what they were worth if they could get them to Kansas City. And from there, of course, spread out through the whole country by rail. So what happened is that they developed this cattle drive trail. And it was about 1,000 miles long from Texas to Kansas City, through Oklahoma primarily. A very dangerous and hard trip, to be sure. And so anyway, this park, and I know that as I talk, we'll put up pictures. They had bronze statues in the park, as well as actually a stream with a nice waterfall that ran through the park. But the statues were just reminiscent of the cattle and the Longhorns, the Texas Longhorns, that they drove. Now, oftentimes, there were as many as 10,000 cattle at a time. 500 was the smallest cattle drive, 10,000 was the largest, averaging about 3,000. What did it take to drive 3,000 cattle that far? It took about 10 to 15 cowboys. It took a chuck wagon and cook to go, and it took another guy to handle all the horses at night and make sure they were bedded down and ready to go again the next day. Each day they would try to keep the cattle in line, and by the way, they would go from spring through the summer, because it was during those times that the grass along the way was enough for the cattle to eat. So really, they didn't go very fast. The average was only 10 miles per day. And they would stop at a watering hole and bed for the night. What a life. That would have been so hard, and that's why I picked the verse for today, because the guys who saw it as working for the Lord, just like any profession really, they would be able to have a much better attitude that they were doing this to provide for their family, but yes, they're to do a good job. And when they do, then the Lord watches that. And that's true for anything we do also. The Chisholm Trail. I learned so much about that. The biggest years ended up being from 1871 to 1873. And then after that, it started to dwindle off, partly because the Native Americans along the way really resented them going through their lands. And they started putting up blockades or even barbed wire along the way, as did some of the other ranchers that they didn't want their land crossed. So it got harder and harder, and eventually, of course, the railroad and other would come to Texas, and they could ship directly. I think that was a few years later. It was something that now is marked along the way, including evidently the park where I was, and they have put the markers to mark that trail all along the way. So the next time that you see a Western, think about what that life is like. It's not the glorified thing that we often see on TV or movies. It was hard, hard work. And I think that hard work is what eventually led to the spirit that we feel as we travel throughout this state of rugged Americans, and don't tell us what to do. We're going to do what we think is right. Now the neat thing is, from all that we've been seeing is that there are a lot of Christians here that are still influencing the government and the culture, and that's encouraging. Next week, we're going to move from talking about things we did in Austin to talking about things we're doing right here. And we're in another area that you'll recognize. But I'm anxious to tell you about this lake and where we are. So today it was about the Chisholm Trail. Tomorrow I have a special show, that the way the Lord touched me while we were in Austin. So I hope you won't miss that. But I hope you have a great day in the Lord. Walk closely with Him. Spend some time alone with Him. You'll be blessed if you do. But thanks for tuning in. We started our day together. And I hope that you can think about God's Word throughout the day. God bless. Hey, I'll see you tomorrow.
Beautiful day. It's wonderful. This is the day that the Lord has